July 7, 1937. After a series of shootings in Beijing, the war between Japan and China broke out in a generalized and merciless way after 6 years of high tension. After this incident, Japan and China would enter into a war of annihilation that would last 8 years and kill more than 20 million people, making the Asian country the largest front in the war without taking into account that of the Soviet Union. Both nations had been accumulating tension since the first war between them, which occurred in 1895, in which China had lost the territory of Korea and Taiwan to the Japanese. Already in September 1931, Japan invaded and took the Chinese province of Manchuria, baptizing it with the name of Manchukuo and putting the Guangdong Army as guard, which was one of the most radical in Japan. Not content with that, in 1933, the Japanese invaded and took the province of Rihe. The Chinese uselessly organize a desperate defense in the middle of the Great Wall, in which they come to defend themselves with swords and bayonets. While all this was happening, China had been in a civil war since 1927, on one side the Nationalist Party called the Kuomintang led by Chiang Kai-shek and on the other the Chinese Communist Party led by Mao Zedong and other leaders. These two parties were in a fight to the death for control of the country, a situation that Japan exploited to its advantage by aggressively occupying Chinese territory. Year 1935. Again the Japanese violated Chinese sovereignty by force and obtained the province of Hebei, through the secret agreement Hiyumizu, that ceded the territory. The Chinese people find out about this loss through the press, and protests break out. Naturally the spirits are very heated and war drums sound. Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek, after considering the situation, had decided to cede the region because he was busy fighting the Chinese Communist movement and could not deal with two enemies at the same time. But that would soon change. On the other hand, the Soviet Union had been trying to spread communism in China by supporting Mao Zedong's movement, which was fighting against the nationalist Kuomintang government. But this changed from 1935, when the Soviets changed their objective towards keeping the peace and achieving an alliance between both Chinese sides to put a stop to the Japanese, who were already beginning to be a threat to Stalin and the Soviet Union. To the will of the USSR, it ends up adding the kidnapping of Chiang Kai-shek by two Chinese generals, who keep him captive to force him to end the civil war by making peace with Mao and thus face the Japanese. In this way, and with the Chinese people supporting the ceasefire, communists and anti-communists unite to fight the Empire of Japan, which is threatening the integrity of the ancient Chinese nation. This alliance is known as the Second United Front, and although in theory they are allies, in reality they will act independently, making the communists more a guerrilla war and the nationalists a conventional war with what they have at hand. Before this alliance, the total war against Japan did not take long to break out, starting with small combats in the city of Beijing and soon spreading to other regions. A month after the shooting began, Japan dispatched 200,000 men to North China, and managed to occupy Beijing and Tianjin without too much resistance. The Chinese from the beginning know that they do not have the firepower to drive out the Japanese, so they decide to bet on a war of attrition in the hope that the Japanese will wear themselves out fighting other powers. Mentioning other powers, in those years and up to 1941, China had the support of Nazi Germany with which it maintained a commercial and military exchange. The Germans sent delegates of all kinds, set up armament factories and even finance railways and roads. Even 80,000 Chinese soldiers are trained in the tactics of the German Wehrmacht, in the image and likeness. Even German Kar 98K rifles are produced in China itself. But in addition to this aid, the Japanese must face 432 million Chinese and fight in a very extensive terrain and a very varied geography. The Empire of Japan had just entered a front that would cost it a lot of material resources, but also human resources, China occupying 65% of the Japanese troops during World War II. August 1937. The Japanese managed to take almost all of North China, where they create the Mongolian Autonomous Government, supported by local leaders. The troops to the north are commanded by General Hideki Tojo, who would later become Prime Minister of Japan. From the north the Japanese launch an offensive towards the south, to take the capital Nanking and the city of Shanghai. But the city of Shanghai would be the first stone in the shoe for the Japanese. The Chinese used their strategy of trading space for time, taking advantage of the large expanses and numerous cities to buy time and thus organize a decent defense. The Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek decides to send his best troops to defend Shanghai while evacuating the government headquarters from Nanking to the city of Wuhan. Some of its industries are also evacuated to the interior, just as Stalin would later do in the Soviet Union in the face of the German invasion. When the conflict began, the Japanese had the advantage of already having some military forces in Shanghai, due to an agreement signed with China in 1933. The Chinese gambled to drive them out using their sheer numbers, but the Japanese entrenched themselves in bunkers and hold out until reinforcements arrive by sea. The Japanese troops under the command of Iwane Matsui try to land several times on the bordering coasts of Shanghai, but the Chinese resistance is very strong. After 2 weeks of fighting, the Japanese manage to take the coastal town of Baoshan and can begin to accumulate troops to march on Shanghai. But between Baoshan and Shanghai lies the city of Luodian, where all hell breaks loose on earth. Chiang Kai-shek had already provided for the defense of Luodian on the advice of the German delegate von Falkenhausen, assigning 300,000 soldiers for its defense. The Japanese attack with only 100,000 men and some tanks, but with highly coordinated and effective artillery. In short, the fight for Luodian lasts almost 1 month, and demonstrates the Chinese inability to carry out offensives in an organized and joint manner. The Japanese artillery managed to degrade the Chinese forces until their total withdrawal. After the fall of Luodian, the Chinese resisted for a while longer in the Dachang area, but it also fell into Japanese hands. Finally, the Japanese conquest is consecrated with the landing of 3 divisions in the south of Shanghai, Hangzhou, before which the Chinese must evacuate their positions so as not to be completely crushed. In the battle for Shanghai, the Chinese lose 60% of their elite troops that had been trained by German advisors, as well as war material that will be difficult to replace. But while this battle is going on, Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek is awaiting the outcome of a conference in Brussels, where he hopes to get support from the United States and England. The Chinese government hopes to resist in Shanghai by showing that it was possible to win the war, but that is of little value to the Westerners, who end up turning a deaf ear to calls for help. The West will not send any help. China is alone. And what is worse, the United States continues to sell large amounts of fuel to Japan and will continue to do so until July 1941. It will not be until 1940, when Japan touches the interests of France in Indochina, that Westerners begin to worry. After the European rejection in Brussels, the Chinese government asks the Soviets for help over and over again, but without obtaining results. With no material help from anywhere, the outlook for the millennial giant grows darker. After the fall of Shanghai, the fall of the old capital Nanjing looms. The remnants of China's elite troops are not heading to defend the old capital, but marching towards the city of Wuhan to rest and reorganize. In turn, hundreds of thousands of civilians flee from Nanking, seeing the approaching disaster. The Chinese government assumes that the city will pass into Japanese hands, so it orders the burning and destruction of farms, forests, and offices to prevent them from being used by the invaders. The poor Chinese resistance in Nanking is made up of recruits with little training, and for this reason it crumbles as soon as the attack begins. Upon entering the city, the Japanese perpetrate one of the worst massacres in history, murdering, raping and robbing the inhabitants of the city. Squads of soldiers enter Chinese homes and using bayonets end thousands and thousands of innocent lives. In the image you can see 2 Japanese soldiers competing with each other to see who reaches 100 fatalities executed with their katanas. The only safe zone is a safe zone, organized by a German diplomat, who in the face of Japanese atrocities, requests a safe zone for Westerners. The Japanese agree, but diplomat John Robe includes more than 200,000 Chinese in the area, which he says saves their lives. After 6 weeks of violence and impunity, the city is a ghost of what it was before, but the war had to continue. After the Nanjing disaster, Chiang Kai-shek once again moved the Chinese capital, this time from Wuhan to the 1,000-year-old city of Chongqing, located in the interior of the country and surrounded by high mountains. At the end of 1937, negotiations began with the German ambassador as a mediator to sign peace, but the Chinese government refused to accept the Japanese conquests of Peking, Manchuria, Nanking, and Shanghai. Japan compulsorily claimed these provinces as its territory, and since there was no agreement, the conflict continued to escalate. The next big battle happened in mid-1938, in the great city of Wuhan, which is home to the Chinese headquarters and still many government offices. By May 1938, the Japanese captured Pengcheng and were preparing to advance towards Wuhan from the north. The Chinese leader, desperate to buy time to at least evacuate the city of Wuhan, ends up making a drastic and historic decision. He freed the levees of the Yellow River in order to flood huge tracts of land and prevent the Japanese advance from the north. By releasing the waters of the river, a torrent of water of millions of liters is released, flooding thousands of towns and destroying thousands of kilometers of crops. A disaster unparalleled in history is generated. Several million inhabitants are displaced from their homes and 800,000 Chinese lose their lives due to this flood. Although the invaders cannot now attack from the north, they do so from the south. The Japanese army then advances in two columns, one along the Yangtze River and the other north of the Dabiai Mountains, fighting several battles until they reach the city of Wuhan. The battle for Wuhan is long and bloody, stretching for almost 5 months. The Japanese believed that with a victory in Wuhan the Chinese resistance would end and they would win the war. But the Chinese are highly motivated, comparing Wuhan to the Battle of Madrid in the Spanish Civil War. On that occasion, the Republicans had repulsed the fascist attack by Franco's troops and victory had become a symbol throughout the rest of the war. At the time of the battle, Wuhan's value was that it served as a central communications point connecting southern China with the interior of the country. The Chinese, despite having lost a lot of territory, continue to trade with the world from the railway line that starts from British Hong Kong, passing through Guangzhou and reaching Wuhan. Through this route, 60,000 tons of goods pass each month, providing oxygen to the Chinese war effort. The Japanese know that as long as this trade route exists, Wuhan will continue to resist the encirclement, so they decide to nip the route in the bud. The Japanese army proceeds to blockade the Guangzhou province and then bombard it. Meanwhile, the Japanese army uses poisonous chemical gases to push back the Chinese who still sell their defeat dearly. Finally, the Chinese army in Wuhan, which was still offering resistance, decided to withdraw because with the loss of the port of Guangzhou and without a trade route, the city had lost its strategic importance. The Chinese resistance is now moving to the distant province of Sichuan. Located in the interior of the country and surrounded by mountains, this area is inaccessible to Japanese ground troops. The new capital Chongqing will manage to hold out until the end of the war. As the battle for Wuhan rages, relations between China and Germany begin to cool. The new foreign minister of Germany, Joachim von Ribbentrop, is pro-Japanese, which is why he recognizes the Japanese independence of Manchuria, withdraws German delegations in China and ends arms exports to Chinese territory. But instead of Germany, the support of another protagonist of the global theater emerges. The Soviet Union, ruled by Stalin, begins to send aid to the desperate Chinese government. During the first year, the Soviets sent China 900 planes, 82 tanks, 2,000 guns, 10,000 machine guns, and 2,000 vehicles, as well as 2,000 pilots and 3,000 military advisors, among them the future Soviet Marshal and hero Georgy Zhukov. The Soviets send aid in an unorthodox way, on camelbacks, across the northwest border with China. In general, between 2,000 and 3,000 tons of war material per month cross the border. The Chinese repay the aid by shipping rare metals but also hold out the hope that the Soviet Union will enter the war against Japan at some point. This hope has its greatest strength with the Battle of Jalingol, where the Japanese and the Soviets clash hard in a border conflict, ending in a heavy Japanese defeat. But this serious incident ends up giving rise to a neutrality pact between the two countries, signed in April 1941, which throws overboard the Chinese hope of greater Soviet support. To make matters worse, the Germans invaded the Soviet Union months later, making Soviet aid to China very small. Towards the end of 1938, the Empire of Japan controls the largest Chinese industrial centers, and to concretize the situation, it takes several ports on the coast to prevent trade. In this way, he hopes that the Chinese resistance will weaken and they will be able to withdraw troops to Japan to lower the costs of the war that were being too high. In addition to this, the Japanese set up biological research bases under the name of squads that are dedicated to experimenting on diseases and pests using living people. In Manchuria, Nanking, Guangzhou and also Singapore, scientific complexes are rising up, committing all kinds of atrocities, from operating on people alive and without anesthesia or injecting them with animal blood to testing bubonic plague bombs on living prisoners. The horrors of these squads follow one another and are destined for war. As a result, the flea bomb is born, which spreads the bubonic plague, and also a defoliant bomb, which destroys crops. These weapons are dumped across vast areas controlled by China, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. The person in charge of this horror leads Squad 731, and his name was Shiro Ishii. At the end of the war, Ishii will order all evidence of the complexes to be destroyed and buried and will manage to escape alive to Tokyo, where he will live free until 1959. Returning to the conflict, in 1939 more than 800,000 Japanese are occupying China, who receive a salary and must be equipped with a uniform, weapons, ammunition, horses and vehicles to mobilize. All of which implies a very large expense for the Japanese economy. China now only controls the interior of the country, but its vast population of 400 million, led by the Communist and Nationalist parties, is ready to take any blows fate may bring. Around August 20, 1940, the Chinese Communist Party launched the Great 100 Regiment Guerrilla Offensive, a movement behind Japanese lines, destined to cause chaos and destruction in the occupied areas. The offensive, commanded by General Peng Dehuai, aims to destroy railways, bridges and industries that the Japanese were using in their favor. The campaign achieved initial success, destroying 600 kilometers of railway lines as well as bridges and the Jingshin coal mine, which was of importance to the Japanese. Despite this, the attack, which has 200,000 Chinese, is losing momentum over the weeks. The Japanese, who see their authority being totally challenged by the Communists, respond harshly by carrying out aggressive, cleansing campaigns in rural areas and launching a new policy of annihilation. This terrible policy is called Sankosakusen, or that of the Three All. It intends to burn everything, kill everything, and steal everything that is in opposition to the Japanese occupation. Targeting communist bases that are camouflaged in thousands of towns and cities. Under this vision, led by Yasuji Okamura in the northern part of China, the Japanese caused the death of 3 million Chinese, a number much higher than the Nanking massacre. Okamura's strategy consists of burning down villages, driving the inhabitants out of their homes, confiscating animals, grain and mobilizing peasants to build trenches, towers or surveillance posts in order to control the movement of communist cells in those provinces. Returning to the war, in December 1941, Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, which caused the Americans to finally start sending aid to the Chinese government. First, through a loan of $245 million at that time, which would be $7 billion today. And then with the shipment of war material and advisors. This aid is a welcome relief for Chiang Kai-shek, who is struggling with a collapsing Chinese economy, which at times seems to be getting out of hand due to high inflation and low productivity in areas he still controls. Not only must the Chinese government recruit, train, and organize millions of troops, but also to organize, feed, and put to work another 200 million people who are often expelled from their villages and find themselves migrating from one province to another. Chinese regions and cities are bombed with impunity by Japan, including the capital Chongqing, which is destroyed several times throughout the war. But the problem is not only Japan. The Chinese themselves increase their problems with rampant corruption, which affects the food and equipment of the troops that are sold on the black market. In the zone occupied by Japan, there are 200 million Chinese, for whom the war means 6 to 8 years of Japanese occupation and control. With this in mind, the Japanese implant puppet states in the conquered provinces, such as Manchuria, Mongolia, and the Yangtze River area. In these places, and as throughout Japan, the Japanese intelligence groups, the Kempeitai and the Tako, operate, identifying opponents and silencing them in undignified ways. In order to please the soldiers in the army, and in turn to avoid mass rapes that can generate anti-Japanese sentiment, the state organizes brothels and stations to satisfy its troops. Around 300,000 women are deceived and apply for a job that will end up being prostitution in 10-hour days and with negligible pay. On some occasions they are directly kidnapped by a unit and taken prisoner for the rest of the war, remaining at the mercy of the Japanese troops. This type of outrage ends up crossing the Chinese border and extends through all the territories occupied by Japan. Although the invaders seek to exploit the occupied areas for their own benefit, the economies of these places end up stagnant and with galloping inflation. In Shanghai there are 600,000 people without a permanent job. Often the lower classes join the provincial collaborationist army just so they can put a plate of food on the table. In some rural areas, power passes into the hands of armed gangs that exploit local populations. And in other places, Chinese peasants go over to the Japanese side if the Japanese provide them with paid work and security for their families. The situation was thus a great every man for himself, where each family sought to survive in the best possible way. In March 1940, the nationalist government of Nanking was founded, governed by Wang Jingwei, which rivals the Chinese government of Chiang Kai-shek. This new country has 60 million people and has its own army armed with Japanese planes and tanks. But despite the latter, it will mainly act as a second line of defense against Chinese attacks. In a broader context, the Japanese promote the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, as a bloc of Asian countries free from Western influence and where Japan is the liberator of the continent from foreign powers. The reality is that all the member countries had been invaded by Japan except Thailand. In Japan this idea of propaganda runs deep in the population, and from the beginning it is claimed that their soldiers have liberated these countries so that they could be governed by their own people, which is a lie. But while the Japanese impose and condition the places they occupy, they also encourage the independence of India and the Philippines to weaken England and the United States. Thus, Free India and the Second Philippine Republic were founded, to fight the West together with Japan. Returning to the fight, in June 1941 the Japanese conquered the strategic city of Ichang next to the Yangtze River, from where the Chinese sent abundant supplies to Chongqing. This reduces the supply of the Chinese capital, which is located among the high mountains. Shek to negotiate peace, but these attempts fail once again. The Chinese government refuses to accept the loss of almost half of its territory to Japanese arrogance. The Japanese, after 4 years of war, continue their campaign to isolate China, entering more and more inland and taking all the important ports. In December 1941, while attacking Pearl Harbor, they also took Hong Kong Island, which was under British jurisdiction. Hong Kong is defended by a mix of British, Canadian and Indian, who, being outnumbered 3-1, can't do much but still put up a fight and suffer between 1,000 and 2,000 dead. The Japanese occupied Hong Kong and remained there until the total surrender in 1945. After Pearl Harbor and with the entry of the United States into the war, a group of mercenaries called the Flying Tigers was created. These are American pilots who are discharged and sent to China as civilians. Due to this, if they were captured, the government would ignore them and the Japanese would summarily execute them. The salary is a mere $600 a month and another $600 for each enemy plane shot down. It is clear that they do not do it for the salary that is little for risking their lives, but for flying between the remote mountains and Chinese jungles in search of the enemy, knowing that a mistake can be fatal. These American pilots obey the American Captain Claire Chennault, retired from the Air Force and main advisor in this aspect of the Chinese government. Between March and May 1942, Chinese soldiers fought alongside the British in Burma and in some cases well, but are unable to prevent the Japanese advance. At the cost of 1,200 dead and 3,000 wounded, the Japanese managed to seize Burma and cut off one more supply line to China. Because of this, it was decided to start supplying China by air from India over the Himalayas. This route, due to the mountainous landscape, is baptized as the Hump. Transport planes take off from northeast India, landing 800 kilometers away at any of the Chinese-held airfields. The flights are accompanied by bad weather, communication losses, and Japanese attacks. In total, 1,500 airmen are lost, in what ends up being the longest airlift in history. These trips are mostly to supply the B-29 bombers that the United States has installed in China, from where they take flight to Japan. In addition to the airlift, the Chinese and Americans painstakingly built another route from India to China, the Lido Highway. It has more than 1,000 miles and crosses all kinds of geographies, from jungles to mountains. The route was opened in late 1944 but does not move much cargo through the mountainous terrain. Winston Churchill will baptize it as an absolute waste of time and resources. In this context, we must mention the Chinese Expeditionary Force, which is destined for India and Burma and is made up of 275,000 soldiers. This force is under the command of U.S. General Joseph Stilwell, who gets along very badly with the Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek. They often argue and make cross complaints. Chiang, on the other hand, has a great friendship with Claire Chennault, the leader of the Flying Tigers and advisor to Chinese aviation. The Chinese forces in Burma under the command of Stilwell have the objective of helping England to protect British India. China thus fought in its territory but also in India and Burma. Around 1942, the Japanese Empire is fighting on two fronts, on the one hand in China where it was stagnant and consuming high resources, and on the other hand against the United States in the Pacific, which represents a greater threat. Due to this, the Japanese General Staff decreased the offensive activities in China in the years 1942 and 1943. The U.S. threat is now the main concern, even within China, where offensives are aimed at capturing American bases operating on Chinese territory. Around April 1942, after the first U.S. bombardments of Japan, the Japanese began a tough campaign in Zhejiang, the main destination for American planes when they landed. In retaliation, in 3 months 100,000 Japanese soldiers supported by the Air Force killed 250,000 Chinese, civilians, and soldiers. But an even more tragic event takes place in 1942 and 1943, in the Chinese province of Hunan. This district had already suffered much from the flooding of the Yellow River in 1938 and then the brutal Japanese occupation. For more, in 1942, a summer drought arrives, killing a large part of the crops and then a plague of locusts. All this contributes to the generation of a great famine, which ends up causing parents to sell their children in order to survive. Desperate families felled the trees and ate the bark and leaves from the branches trying to avoid the arrival of death. Around 700,000 Chinese people lose their lives in this terrible event. Millions of inhabitants flee the region as best they can, abandoning their homes to avoid dying of hunger. Others, not even having a donkey as a means of transportation, are condemned to starvation. In late November 1943, Chiang attended the Cairo Conference, confirming China as one of the 4 major Allied powers on paper. The Allies agreed that after the war China would obtain Manchuria, Formosa, and the Pescadores Islands. But despite Allied support, the situation of the Chinese government was very bad. In April 1944, the Japanese regained momentum and launched the biggest maneuver of the entire war. Called Operation Ichigo, it was aimed at unifying the Japanese Empire, linking Siberia with Singapore by the same railway line. Almost all of the occupied territory would be connected from north to south, facilitating trade and the movement of troops. Secondary objectives would seek to destroy U.S. bases and inflict damage on the Chinese army. For these purposes, the Japanese mustered 500,000 soldiers, along with 100,000 Chinese from the puppet states, in addition to 800 tanks and 1,500 artillery pieces. The Chinese who are trying to resist are commanded by General Tang Enbo and are supported by the United States Air Force. The Japanese advance begins in April forcefully in the province of Hunan. Quickly the tank columns break the front and turn towards the city of Luoyang. Right now, the Chinese army is facing a rebellion by its own peasants, who are furious about the famine the previous year and have received pro-Japanese propaganda from the Chinese government in Nanking. The front becomes chaotic and it is impossible to stop the Japanese advance, Luoyang falling after a short time. While this attack was taking place, the Japanese also attacked British India in what became known as Operation Yugo, where they are defeated by the English and Indians in the battles of Impul and Kohima. Continuing with Operation Ichigo, after this, the Japanese columns descend following the railway until they reach the city of Changsha, which is surrounded by 200,000 soldiers and successfully taken in June. After the capture of Changsha, the Japanese rushed following the train tracks until they reached the city of Guilin, Map. At the same time that this is happening, about 100,000 Japanese troops are advancing north from Canton to link up with the attack coming down from Changsha. Added to this is another Japanese attack from Vietnam, which crosses the jungles to exit South China. Finally, the different Japanese columns meet in the province of Guangxi, unifying China from south to north. The consequences for the Chinese government are catastrophic. Control has been lost of 8 provinces and 100 million inhabitants that are now part of the Japanese occupation. Access to the sea is also completely lost and around 500,000 soldiers are killed or taken prisoner. It is clear that if a stroke of luck does not happen, China will be part of Japan for many years. This stroke of luck is called the United States of America, and it has been advancing slowly but surely through the Pacific Islands. The Americans put pressure on Japan with blood and fire, managing to conquer the islands of Guam, Iwo Jima, and finally Okinawa. In addition, as we have already reported in another video, the American bombings completely destroyed Japanese cities and all their infrastructure, weakening and breaking the Japanese ability to organize an effective resistance. Even the capital Tokyo was completely burned down in March 1945, with 100,000 people perishing on the spot. Finally, the Americans are preparing to invade the main islands through Operation Downfall. But even at this time the Japanese still maintain at least 1 million troops in China, seeking to hold on to their conquests until the last day. Unexpectedly, the blow comes from the north, with the Soviet Union's attack on Manchuria, which devastates the Japanese Guangdong Army and despairs the Imperial High Command. Added to this are the 2 American atomic bombs that force the emperor to surrender unconditionally. Japan falls to its knees. The Japanese people learn of the surrender from a message on the radio, which is misunderstood by the emperor's formality in speaking. There is even a brief coup attempt, which fails after a few hours. The war was over. On the Asian continent, the latest fighting takes place in the provinces of Hunan and Guangxi, where the Chinese recover some cities that they had lost during the Ichigo operation. Already after the surrender of the emperor, more than 1 million Japanese soldiers surrendered to the Chinese general He Ying-chin. The following year up to 28 Japanese leaders, including the Prime Minister, were sentenced to death or life imprisonment during the so-called Tokyo trials. Although these trials leave the emperor safe and do not investigate the crimes that occurred in China, such as the Nanking Massacre or Squad 731, China had resisted, stoic and immovable, those years of hardship and sacrifice, of resistance to the enemy who tried to dominate her and reduce her to her minimum expression. More than 20 million lives had been taken by the Japanese invasion and even greater the number of refugees. But there was still plenty of time for the Chinese to have a lasting peace. Before the invasion there had been a civil war, and now it must continue. Communists and nationalists returned to the conflict for 4 more years. Finally, after the communist victory, on October 1, 1949, the People's Republic of China was born, which after several decades of stagnation and horrors, in 1978 would begin to claim its place in the world theater until it became the dragon it is today.